Tonight we dive into John chapter 4, and it is a good chapter, and there's a lot there. So let's get going with it. If you were here last week, I suggested to you that it was okay that we didn't finish John chapter 3, because at the end of John chapter 3, there was something very important that we were going to start with this week that leads into John chapter 4. And so I want to take us back to John chapter 3, specifically verse 26. This is at a point where John the Baptist is giving his last testimony in the book of John about who Jesus is, and he's encouraging his faithful disciples to go ahead and follow that Jesus character because it's really all about him. And all of this comes up at a time when there's this discussion about Jewish purification going on, and John's people come to him and they say, I don't know if you've noticed this, but that guy who was with you beyond the Jordan, Jesus, the guy that you've testified about, he is baptizing and all the people are going to him. So all these people are not coming to John, but they're going to him. And it's interesting, John's response. And he just said, you can't take something that's not yours. That's kind of how he starts. And then he gets all bridegroomy on us, right? We're kind of out of the blue. It's kind of weird language. First of all, we just say groom in our culture. We don't say bridegroom very often. At least I don't. I don't know if you do. Maybe you could start today and create some cultural change. But he says this statement, and I've bolded it up on my screen. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. Just out of the blue. I mean, we're just talking about this guy that was beyond the Jordan and people following, and he goes into this language about brides and bridegrooms. But the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him, what does he hear? He hears the voice of the bridegroom, right? He rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Rejoicing greatly. And then he says, this joy of mine has been made full. He concludes with this thought, that Jesus character, must increase. More people are going to start following him. And it's time for me to start decreasing. In other words, it's time for you to leave and go, because it's all about him. And there's a context here. We're very familiar with this language, this bridegroom, and we know it from this passage, but there's actually a secondary Old Testament context for this. And I actually found this as I was teaching one of my college classes and marching through the Old Testament through one of the prophets. There's a prophet called Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is a prophet after the kingdoms have been divided into the northern 10 tribes and the southern 2 tribes, Israel and Judah. Jeremiah is a prophet to the southern 2, and it's the last group that goes into exile. In 586, Babylon comes and takes it away. And so I'm back in Jeremiah chapter 25, and Jeremiah is prophesying to that southern kingdom about what's about to happen. And it says, the word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah. And it was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Babylon takes over Assyria, and immediately Babylon comes in and conquers Judah, the southern kingdom. And so Jeremiah is predicting that this is going to happen. He's forthtelling. And the Lord has sent you all of his servants and the prophets again and again, but you have not listened or inclined your ear to them. You haven't heard the voice of the Lord, right? And then I'm scooting down just a little bit. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, here's what's going to happen. Jeremiah gives them this message. I will send all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and he will bring them against this land and utterly destroy you. It'll be a lasting desolation. And moreover, now here, listen. Moreover, I will take from them, the land of Judah, the voice of joy. The voice of joy will disappear in the land of Judah when this happens, when they go into exile. And the voice of gladness. And the voice, you see it, of the bridegroom. But that's not it. And the voice of the bride. All of these things will be disappearing from the land when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes you into exile. Joy will leave, the voice of the bridegroom will leave, and the voice of the bride will leave. Well, that's interesting. The whole land will be in desolation and horror. These nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it's in that 70 years, after that 70 years, they come back into the land, and then they're there for the whole intertestamental period, long period of time. And then John shows up. The last of the Old Testament prophets, I'm going to argue, even though we find him in the New Testament. He is an Old Testament prophet because he was the one prophesied that would come before the Messiah would come. And he shows up, and what does he say? He hears. He has, number one, he has an ear inclined to hear, right? And he says, I hear the voice of the bridegroom. And what else has returned? His joy. The voice of joy has returned to the land after all this time. Do you see that? So this language that John the Baptist uses to describe Jesus as a bridegroom is fulfillment language. It's fulfillment language that, yes, the exile did happen. Yes, the voice of the bridegroom did leave. And did you notice that even in the Old Testament, the voice of the bride is spoken of? It's the voice of the bride. And in turn, the voice of the bride has returned to the land as well. And we know that because this is in context of all these people following the bridegroom. This is the bride. We like to sometimes think that the bride was created in Acts chapter 2 at the day of Pentecost when the church was created. And in one sense, if you define it that way, that's totally true. But based on Old Testament imagery that John the Baptist resurrects out of the book of Jeremiah, I'm going to suggest to you that all of the instances that we see where Jesus walks throughout the land and people come to him in faith, that is the bride. And when they speak, that is the voice of the bride talking about her bridegroom. Does that make sense? It's a collective bride. It's just not one person. And we see the bride collecting around Jesus as he goes through his ministry. All that to say, we're now done with chapter 3. And moving on to chapter 4, we're right in line because you probably didn't know it, but John, the author of this gospel, has been taking you on a little bit of a journey. He's been dropping clues all along the way, and I haven't necessarily pointed them out to you, but you may have noticed them. And it's a journey that concludes here in John chapter 4. And it's one of the ways that New Testament authors present Jesus as the Messiah. There's several different ways. They can talk about how he fulfills Scripture. They can talk about just what he says and what he does. But another way that the New Testament authors present Jesus as this Messiah character is they tie him back to Old Testament characters that play prominent roles in the nation of Israel. And in this way, we saw it in the book of Matthew where Jesus was promoted as the new Moses. He had 5 discourses, and Moses had 5 books. John is doing that. He's been doing that for the first 4 chapters of this book, and you may not have noticed. But I'm going to try and walk you through it. What character from the Old Testament? I'm going to suggest to you that John is presenting Jesus as the new Jacob. Remember the Jacob character in the Old Testament? Well, if you don't, let me quickly walk through a portion of his story. Okay? So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 27, and I'll have it flashing up here as we work our way through. Genesis 27:41, Jacob leaves his father's house under the hatred, despise of his brother. Now, why was his brother angry? Because Jacob had been deceitful. In fact, the Hebrew root of the name Jacob is one of guile and deceit. Okay? So, Jacob's living up to his name. He's full of guile. And he's having to leave his home. His father actually sends him away, and his brother is ready to kill him. Right? And then we go to Genesis 28:2, and he ends up traveling to a far country, a foreign country. And his father is sending him to this place in search of, do you know? In search of a bride. Go find a bride from this place so that you don't intermingle with the worship practices of the people that we are living around now. And so he heads out on his journey, and I've highlighted a lot here. And he travels, on his travel, he stops at a certain place, and he lays down, puts his head on a stone, and he has a dream. And you remember the dream? This dream is a vision of a ladder, and it's not like a fireman's ladder, it's more like a ziggurat, a big structure that reaches up into heaven. And at the top of that structure, God is there, and he speaks at the top of the ladder, and he gives the promise to Jacob that had been given to all of his predecessors, that out of you, the whole world will be blessed. And so Jacob wakes from his dream. He takes that rock, that stone, and he kind of props it up and says, when people walk by this stone that's been propped up, they're going to remember that what happened here, that I had a dream, and we're going to call this place Bethel, the house of God. Beit El, house of God. And he does that, and then he continues on his journey. So we're now in Genesis 29, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, chapter 29, 1 through 7. Jacob continues on his journey, and he finds himself in a foreign land, and he comes to a well in that foreign land. And the text specifically says what time of day it is down here in verse 7. Behold, it's still high day, which means what? It's noon, right? So he's at a well at noon in a foreign land. And who does he meet there? Well, he meets his bride, doesn't he? A girl by the name of Rachel. And tell me a little bit about Rachel, if you remember. She good looking? Yes. She's very good looking. Catches his attention right away. Based on the description given in the book of Genesis, I think he's talking about the outward appearance. Maybe looking at her soul as well, right? We can hope so. But what kind of a position does this Rachel have? Well, she's a younger sister. That's a family dynamic that plays out later in interesting terms, right? We saw that on Jerry Springer. And then, but as she's approaching the well, why is she approaching the well at noon? Do we know? Because she is a shepherdess. The text actually says that. She has a flock of her own, right? That she tends for, that look after her for their guidance. And so Jacob ends up offering water to Rachel and her flock. Thus ends the story of Jacob from the book of Genesis. Now, let's hop forward. I want to walk you through the book of John, because I'm going to present to you my theory that I've borrowed from someone else, is that John is, along the way, putting little Easter eggs. And we wouldn't call them Easter, because Easter hasn't really happened yet in the story, but little gifts along the way that will be found by his readers. And if you're very versed in the Old Testament story of Jacob, you're going to pick up on these. And maybe you've picked up on some of them, but let me point out as many as I've seen. John 1, Jesus is with God up in heaven. And we get down to John 1:14, and Jesus leaves his Father's house. And the condition when he gets down here on earth is that he's not accepted by his brethren. He's been rejected by his family members. And God sends Jesus on a trip away from his house in search of a bride, right? That comes out a little bit later in the John the Baptist passage that we read. So he's confronted with rejection by his brothers. He begins in John chapter 1 to surround himself with disciples. And how many disciples end up surrounding themselves around Jesus? Close ones. There's 12, right? Well, what does that remind you of? Jacob. Jacob had 12 that surrounded him, right? And if it wasn't his kids, as the story goes on and Jacob becomes Israel and becomes a nation and comes out of slavery and ends up in the wilderness as tribes, it's the 12 tribes, and those 12 tribes are the nation of Jacob, right? So, John really focuses in chapter 1, verse 42 on this naming of Simon, the renaming of Simon, Andrew's brother. He's renamed to Cephas, which is Peter, Petra, which is the Greek word for stone. Now, that might be a stretch. And by itself, I agree. Stone, Peter, that's not a real tight connection. But if you consider it in terms of all the other connections back to Jacob's story, and what comes next is very interesting. Because right after he renames Peter as a stone, by the way, we know from Matthew that this stone, Peter, becomes the foundation of what? The church, which is the house, the bride. Okay, dang it. You're right. It's the bride of Christ. But it's also the house of God. It's the new temple, right? It's the new temple. Peter becomes the foundation stone, and he actually, by renaming him, we can say he kind of props him up and anoints him in that role. Okay? Now, again, by itself, maybe a bit too far, but what happens right after that? Well, Nathanael shows up. He spends a lot of time on the renaming of Peter and this Nathanael character. And Nathanael comes, and they say, come and see him. And he says, behold, Jesus says of Nathanael, an Israelite, Jacob's second name, right? And then what's the description? It's not just any Israelite, it's a true Israelite, in whom there is no deceit or guile or deceptiveness. The name of Jacob. Behold, Israel with no Jacob. See it? And what does he say about this Nathanael character? Well, if you get down to verse 51, he says to Nathanael, these are plural use, so he's talking about all believers in general that are like Nathanael, but he's saying it to Nathanael. Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And what's this a replay of? It's a replay of Jacob's dream that he had at Bethel. It caused him to wake up and prop up the stone and name the place. Now, along his journey in John chapter 2, Jesus is presented as a man that has connections with weddings, right? Now, it's not his wedding in John chapter 2, but he ends up being the one that provides the wine for the wedding feast. It's a dry run for Jesus, right? Because eventually his wedding will come, where he will supply the wine for his wedding. And then we have the passage in John 3:29 that ties again Jesus to this idea of a man who has left his father's house. He's on a journey. He's been rejected by his brother. He's referenced the dream and the stone, and now he's in search of, he is the bridegroom, and he's in search of his bride. Now, let me just ask you a question. If all of these things are actually John's attempt to track the story of Jacob from the Old Testament, what would you expect next in the story? Jacob in the Old Testament has had his dream. He's woken up from the dream. He's propped up the rock. He's named the place. Where does he go next? Well, he travels to a foreign land, and he ends up at a well at noon, and he meets his bride. And what happens with Jesus? He follows the storyline of Jacob. And he ends up at a foreign land, because no Jew will ever go into Samaria just by choice, right? Except Jesus did. And he ends up at a well. What ties does this well have with this character in the Old Testament, by the way? Oh, this is Jacob's well. She even says it. And then she asks an important question. Are you greater than our father Jacob? And what was her expected response to that question? No. But what's the right answer? Yes. And that's the beauty of when authors tie this Jesus character back to Old Testament characters to remind you of the story of how we got to Jesus. They tie him to these Old Testament characters. And so he's like Jacob, and yet he's better than Jacob. Jesus is like Moses, but he's better than Moses. Jesus is the character that fulfills all the Old Testament types and shadows that come before him. And some of those types and shadows are the characters themselves in the Old Testament story. And so John's been doing this. And so let's take a further look. Now, I don't want you to come away from tonight thinking that Pastor Greg thinks that Jesus got married to the Samaritan woman, okay? So we've slipped into symbolism here. Actually, we're talking about symbolism all the way through, right? And so when Jesus shows up at this well, what we're supposed to be asking the question of, what is the character and quality of the person here? Because we know the character and quality that Jacob was looking at, right? And the text seems to suggest that Jacob was more concerned about the exterior qualities of Rachel, right? Jesus shows up as the new Jacob. And does he find a virginal bride ready to be taken? No. In fact, this is the whole conversation. It's the contrast between Rachel and the Samaritan woman is the conversation that Jesus has. And it's her qualities that he points out that the gospel writer is inviting us to consider as we see Jesus exposing his teaching and his theology to the Samaritan woman. And her response is one of faith. And she accepts his proposal and becomes like all of the John the Baptist followers that are now following Jesus. How the bride is starting to follow Jesus. This Samaritan woman is added to the bride, right? Added to the people that are following Jesus. Well, let's take a look at this woman a little more closely now that we kind of know how we got here and what John is trying to do throughout his progression of story. This woman at the well has been presented many different ways, and you've probably heard sermons, you've probably done Bible studies, you've read this story over and over again. Oftentimes she's promoted as an outcast because she's at the well at noon, right? I typed out a little bit because I listened to a sermon from a very well-known preacher that if I were to say his name, everyone would say, oh yeah, I know that guy. He even admits in his sermon that, yeah, this story is very familiar. And he says, here we have a clear model, he says, of the Lord evangelizing a sinner, and it's more clear here than anywhere else in the Gospels. This woman is a Samaritan. He says she's a religious outcast. She's immoral because she's been married several times, okay, in the conversation. She's an ignorant woman. She doesn't know anything about true religion. She's ignorant, he says it twice, uneducated, religiously indifferent. And this is how this woman is often portrayed, as this other, no chance that she has anything right because of where she lives. And if we had more time tonight, I would just encourage you, some of your questions went back to the exile passages. Ezra, we ended up in Ezra and the rift that happened. These Samaritan people have a history in Judaism, but they also have married in just a bunch of other pagan religions. And even their history in Judaism, if you study that more closely, the northern 10 tribes had set up 2 temples because the northern king didn't want them to go down to Jerusalem and do the real worship at the real temple. They set up 2 temples at the north and south of the northern kingdom, and they put golden calves there and said, this is where I want you to worship. So even the Jews that were left in the land that intermarried, their sense of Judaism was a bit tainted even from the beginning because of that divided kingdom. So, I would tend to give you a little opposite picture of this woman. I would tend to say that this woman is religiously minded. And I'm just going off what the text gives us, okay? I would tell you that instead of maybe a social outcast, that maybe we've read too much into her being there at noon. Maybe really the reason she's there at noon is to tie her back to Rachel and Jacob's story, who is there at noon. I would also say that this woman is very spiritually minded, that she, in fact, is expecting a Messiah character. I mean, she says so herself. I don't know about all this confusion about what mountain or where or when, but the Messiah is coming. And when he does, he's going to straighten it all out. Things were very complicated in Jesus' day. We learned that last week with Nicodemus, and I think we're going to learn it here again with the woman at the well. There's some plural yous that I want to point out, and then we're going to get to the last section of this chapter as we close out. Remember last week in Nicodemus' story, we talked about how Jesus, based on the singular and plural yous in the conversation with Nicodemus, I believe Jesus is having a conversation with Nicodemus, a believer, but he's also a part of a group of unbelieving people, the Pharisees. And Jesus, by the use of singular yous to Nicodemus and plural yous to the Pharisees, is having a dual conversation. It doesn't really come through in the English because we just have one word for you. Same thing happens here. John chapter 4, verse 20. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you, now in this translation, we've added people. People is actually italicized because it's not there in the English, or in the original. We've added it to the English because that's a plural you. And you people, you Jews, say that it's Jerusalem. That's where you should worship. And Jesus responds and says, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when it's not going to matter which mountain. You worship the Father at." You is plural. He's talking to the Samaritan woman, but he's talking to her as a representative of a larger group of mostly unbelieving people. You worship, verse 22, plural, you Samaritans worship what you Samaritans don't know. And we, Jews, worship what we do know, for salvation is from us, the Jews. For an hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers, and I believe that Jesus is going and talking to her now, and I think he's identifying her, even though her theology is completely messed up. The Samaritans believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. And they had married in other pagan religions, but out of the first 5 books, you can go back. And there's enough there. The prophets tell us, Jesus tells us, that Moses wrote about me. Jesus says that. And just with the first 5 books, it's possible that this lady, and maybe even others back in her town, have come to understand a promise of a Messiah. And even though it's a confused faith, and maybe misplaced in different ways, I think that there's at least a good possibility that this woman is a woman of faith prior to even meeting Jesus. Now, is it a faith in Jesus? No. It would be an Old Testament faith in a promised Messiah, right? And so by nature, she would have to convert that existing faith in a promise to the fulfillment of that promise, to the actual Messiah himself. And what happens? Jesus says, "I'm that guy." And what's her response? "I'm going to leave my water pot here. Can you watch it?" Right? Now, can we say for certain? No. But there are other times, there's many other times in the Gospels where Jesus reveals himself for who he is, and we don't get this response from people that we would expect to get this response. And so I'm suggesting to you that just by watching this lady respond in the way she does, she might be a believer, unconventional for sure, that's also representing a group that's really unconventional when we talk about faith. They are socially unacceptable. And so if that's true, what we have, we're building this theme, John is building this theme of Nicodemus, who, as I presented last week, is, I think, a believer from an unbelieving group of Pharisees. And Jesus is having a conversation with the individual and the group and giving instructions to both. And I think Jesus is here having a discussion with an individual woman of faith who is a part of a larger group of unbelievers, largely, and giving instruction to both. And then where do you think we're headed next? So let's finish the chapter. We're heading to a nobleman's son, right? Nobleman is the chapter heading, but it's the royal official. And if you go into commentaries, we're all over the place as to whether this person's a Jew or a Gentile. We do not know. But what we do know by the title royal official, he's probably a part of Herod's kingdom somehow. Majority would say Gentile. I don't know that I know enough, and I don't think it really matters, because what we're doing is we're working from south to north. Nicodemus was in the south, where the Jewish population, and he represents the Jewish crowd. And then the Samaritan woman's in the middle of the country, right? Middle district. And now we're working to the north. And what's the north called? Oftentimes in the New Testament, it's called the Galilee of the Gentiles. Now there's a lot of Jews still up there, but it's largely known as the Galilee of the Gentiles. And so let's just say, whether this guy is a Jew or a Gentile, he is completely Hellenized, meaning he has adapted himself into the Greek way of life. He is a royal official in that way, at least. And what do we see here? Maybe some singular and plural use? Maybe. So Jesus said to him in verse 48, he comes with a request, right? And Jesus' response is not to him, but it's to a plural you. So this guy is a person in and of himself, but he's also representing a larger group. That's what I want you to see. So Jesus said to him, unless you, and we've added people again because to help us out in the translation, unless you people see signs and wonders, you people, plural again, simply won't believe. Jesus is saying, man in front of me, the group that you're attached to, won't come to faith unless they see a sign. And then what happens? Jesus says, your son's healed, go. Did this man see a sign? But what does the text say about him? He believed. So by definition, this is a man that is an individual in and of himself, that's a man of faith, but he is not a part of the larger group that Jesus is attaching him to. Because Jesus' statement is, unless you see a sign, you people, you won't come to faith. And this guy doesn't see a sign, and he comes to faith. He is a believing representative from a largely unbelieving group that he represents. Do you see that? So, I've made my case. I'm going to stand on it, whether I'm right or no. I would just want you to consider, what's a good takeaway as we close? What's a good takeaway? I think oftentimes what we do when we read through the Gospels, we assume everybody that Jesus comes upon is neutral when it comes to faith. And that if Jesus presents himself to them and they believe in Jesus, that this is a brand new faith relationship. And I'm not sure, I think it's more complicated than that in first century Judah. I think that there was a remnant. By definition, there has to be a remnant group of people on the earth who have faith in the Old Testament promise of a Messiah. And these would be people like Abraham that are justified in their faith. If they died there without meeting Jesus, even though he was on earth, they would find themselves in heaven because of their faith in a promise that God gave in the Old Testament. And what we see in Jesus happening sometimes is he's coming upon people that already have a faith that's a saving faith, but that they have to transfer their faith to the fulfillment of the promise. And I think that's what John does for us in this little progression in John 3 and John 4 where we see three different scenarios moving south to north in three very different groups that end up all being largely unbelievers that need further instruction on how to come to faith as a group. But the individuals that Jesus is contacting seem to be people that have an existing faith that quickly recognize Jesus for who he is and transfer that faith right over. It's complicated in first century Israel. And if it's complicated then, I'm just going to suggest to you that it's probably complicated now. And it's been complicated since. And so what's the takeaway for us? Well, as we go out of here and we know kind of who we're rubbing shoulders with now, we've got our group. I'm going to suggest to you that we've maybe defined people out there already because of the group they're in as no chance of being spiritually minded people. And I just want to challenge you. By the very nature of being God's creation, they are spiritually minded in some sense. And just because they look different on the outside doesn't necessarily mean that they might not be unsuspecting people of faith or so very close to accepting a message of faith and a Savior that's going to solve the problems that we have. It's complicated, isn't it? Yeah. So as you go, don't be surprised. Have a new set of eyes. Look at people differently. See the potential that Jesus saw that nobody else saw because of the social constraints that they had already placed these people in. And consider, maybe. Dear Lord, thanks for John chapter 4 and the message that it gives to us. God, we just ask as we continue to march through your book that you give clarity, that you allow us to see what the text is saying, that you allow us to process it, and then you allow us to get it into modern day. And so, God, even as Thanksgiving is coming and we're going to see all different types of groups of people, put this in the back. Bring this from the back to the forefront of our minds. Thank you for what you did. In Jesus' name, amen.